Hi, given the coronavirus situation and the cessation of all physical teaching at Exeter, I'm going to be giving this D.H. Lawrence lecture, week 10 on extreme states, virtually, obviously. It would have originally been sort of half a lecture, half a workshop, with myself handing out some poems for you to look at from the collection Birds, Beasts and Flowers. What I'll do is I'll select those and I'll write up some notes and post those on ELE so we can sort of recreate that aspect of it. But for I guess around half an hour, I'll give the lecture half of what we would have done, where I'll attempt to give a general overview of Lawrence's work and career in the aspects that I think would be most useful for study of the fox. So I'm going to begin with biography. There is Lawrence. He's an early 20th century writer, dies in 1930. If you want to hear a bit more, if you want a more extensive biography, you can certainly have a look at the study notes, or for even more, you can look at the Oxford DNB, the Dictionary of National Biography. That's an online resource which will give you much more detail. Of course, there are print biographies of Lawrence. I would be happy to recommend one if you wanted, but I think that's probably far beyond the remit of what you need for this course. I'd like to really identify 5 things before we start about Lawrence's biography that might be useful framings that really help to explain who he was, where he came from, what he was trying to do with his literature. The first, that he's a working class writer. He comes from a Nottinghamshire, that is an East Midlands background. He comes from a mining family, and that really shapes a lot of what he does in the early portion of his career, both in poetry and in fiction. His first major novel, for example, Sons and Lovers, which is very autobiographical. That's quite unusual for modernists. There's a bit of an ethic of impersonality in modernism, but Sons and Lovers is very clearly modelled on Lawrence's own childhood and youth. And also some of his earlier short fiction, so sort of before The Fox, things like Odours of Chrysanthemums. Secondly, despite the fact that a lot of his early prose work was set in this very specific geographical locale of the East Midlands and tried to kind of give a naturalistic rendering of that, he also has a big European dimension, particularly an Italian dimension to his career, and quite a tense relationship to England. There's lots of different reasons for that, including World War I, which obviously plays a big part in the plot and the plotting of The Fox. But Lawrence's experience of wartime was very much conditioned by the fact that he was with, at the time, a German woman, so a woman from the opposing side, Frieda von Richthofen, who was a distant relative of the Red Baron, the German fighter ace, the Baron von Richthofen. And when Frieda and Lawrence stayed in Cornwall, there was a suspicion he was a kind of bohemian artist, she was a German, and they were eventually ejected from Cornwall under suspicions of spying. So Lawrence travelled a lot, not least because before the war, when he first met Frieda, she was married. So they sort of had to elope and go on a grand European tour. And as Lawrence's career continued, he always travelled. He travelled in wider and wider circuits, encompassing places like Sri Lanka and Mexico. And in that sense, a bit like Byron, I suppose, he had a very tense relationship with his homeland. Thirdly, Lawrence is most famous for his long novels. The 2 major works, which were originally conceived as part of a single project called The Sisters. Those novels are The Rainbow and Women in Love. And quite often that means his short fiction, his short story achievements are, if not overlooked, they're certainly less written about them critically, but even when they are written, they're looked at as kind of adjuncts to the ongoing project of writing these much longer novels, even though from the beginning, I guess, Lawrence has always been recognised as someone who had great levels of achievement in the English short story of the 20th century. Number 4 of 5, sex. D.H. Lawrence and sex really do go together, Sex and sexuality is a really big part of his philosophy, his thinking, and his work. And his work has often been intertwined with discussions and debates and indeed controversies about its depiction of sexuality and indeed obscenity that goes from his paintings in the 1920s right up to, most famously, several decades after his death, the furore and ultimately the censorship trials over Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is a very sexually explicit novel. So I guess Lawrence has a reputation as a pornographer, even though he was very, very damning of pornography of his own time, being seeing it as a kind of mutilation of authentic sexuality. But it's very, very difficult to see Lawrence away from the depictions of sex and sexuality in his work. And finally, he's often classed as a modernist. Might come back to that in various ways. There's certain stylistic traits, experimental innovations in his work which allow us to array him alongside other innovators in modernist poetry in particular, and particularly modernist fiction like Virginia Woolf or James Joyce predominantly, I suppose. He certainly was part of cultural circles of the early 20th century, involved in those debates, engaged in those artistic transformations. For example, his poetry was included in some of the early Imagist anthologies, and yet he's always been a sort of out of sync figure, not just because of his working class background, but because of the way he thinks and the way he writes. So he's kind of modernist and not modernist. So that's enough for the biography there. 5 things there: the working class background, the European dimension to his work, the central achievement of his career being those 2 novels, The Rainbow and Women in Love, the place of sex and sexuality and more broadly obscenity and censorship, and finally his uneasy relationship with what we might understand as canonical or mainstream modernism. I'm going to jump off that 5th one really, and thinking about Lawrence and not modernism per se, but modernity. Like many of the modernists, he had acute historical awareness, acute historical consciousness, and of course that can go in multiple ways. You can kind of grasp the idea of a transforming present. You can understand yourself as being on the leading edge of history. You can throw yourself towards the future, as indeed the futurists did. Or you can be much more melancholic or ambivalent or equivocal or even elegiac, and a lot of Anglo-American modernism is understood in those terms, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland being an excellent example. In terms of where we would position D.H. Lawrence, certainly he too had a great acute sensitivity to being in modernity, and he had a very intensive feel for historical crisis. He responded to many of the same things that other artists and writers did in the 1910s and 1920s. That was mass industrialization, mass urbanization, alterations in the political systems that had held sway up until the moment of modernity, so reactions to democracy. Like many modernists, D.H. Lawrence was quite reactionary, very, very suspicious of democratic advance, of rule by mass populations, and he certainly can be seen in one way as a highly right-wing writer, if not a fascist writer, although many of his fellow modernists could be seen as fascist. And World War I, which obviously has such a great influence on the plotting of The Fox, which we're studying this week, a reaction to war, and the bloodshed, the carnage, the mechanisation of World War I. That's very much apparent in his work too. The one thing I want to focus on to sort of push forward is D.H. Lawrence as an anti-modern, not anti-modernist, but anti-modern, as someone deeply, deeply critical of the modernity of his own moment. And that's through a disgust for his own time, a disgust in particular for the bourgeois as the quintessential class. They had cultural, economic, political hegemony at this moment, and a feeling that along with the bourgeoisie came a moment of degeneration, cultural degeneration, artistic degeneration, social degeneration. And there's a lineage here, because even though I've been arraying Lawrence up to this moment alongside people like Eliot or Joyce, D.H. Lawrence, at least initially, and we can see that in some of the early fiction, the kind of lineages he's picking up are much more 19th century ones. Things like the Pre-Raphaelites, for example, or the symbolists, the French symbolists. And these are anti-bourgeois artistic movements who want to move away from the banal, from the conventional, from the cozy, from the domestic, from the everyday, in the name of something more. And we can certainly see that anti-bourgeois attitude in Lawrence. On this slide, I've extracted 3 short extracts from 3 poems from his collection Pansies, which is a very odd collection of poems that he wrote relatively late in his career. They're very, very prosy. They're almost aphoristic. The title Pansies is a pun on pensée, or thoughts. This is a genre going back to people like Pascal. These kind of sketches of an idea. And that's really what these poems are. Their quality as poetry is very, very uneven. I like D.H. Lawrence's poetry, but Pansies is pretty raw, pretty unhewn. But that's really the idea. But we get a sense of that disgust with bourgeois modernity coming through in poems like the ones we have in front of us. How beastly the bourgeois is, especially the male of the species, presentable, eminently presentable. Shall I make you a present of him? Or let us be men, for God's sake, let us be men, not monkeys minding machines, or sitting with our tails curled while the machine amuses us, the radio or film or gramophone. Or kill money, put money out of existence. It is a perverted instinct, a hidden thought which rots the brain, the blood, the bones, the stones, the soul. And you get that kind of dripping contempt for modernity in those 3 short poems. The war, as I've already acknowledged, is a key part of shaping what Lawrence's modernity is, and I guess not necessarily disgust with war. It's worth noting that unlike many of the circles within which Lawrence moved, he wasn't an out-and-out pacifist, and indeed the place of conflict and violence is uncertain in Lawrence's work. But certainly the war stamped its impress on him, and he saw it as a transformational thing with very, very equivocal effects. Like I've already said, he spent a lot of the war in Zena, in Cornwall. That's the cottage he shared in the top right there, the colour image. And obviously he had a very difficult time there. You know, he was suspected of espionage and ejected. So after he leaves England, after the war, going to the continent, writing a collection, for example, about My England, My England. His sort of wounded pride, I suppose, about his time in Cornwall and his time in England during the war years is very much part of that. A few other things to note. His famous novel Lady Chatterley's Lover, it's often seen as just a novel about sex and about obscenity, but it's got some really interesting things to say about industrialisation. So the aristocrat, Sir Clifford Chatterley, that's the man on whom Lady Chatterley cheats with her gamekeeper, Mellors. He is a portrait of disfigured humanity and indeed emasculated masculinity, as Lawrence saw it. And not coincidentally, he is in a wheelchair. He is disabled because of a war injury. And the final thing, which I've represented here with the black and white photograph, alterations in the pattern of the genders. So, as many of you will know, in World War I, as in World War II, the kind of the changes in the way that men abroad fighting in the trenches, that meant women had to play a much greater role in the war economy. Women would work, and that's one of the contexts that is really explicit in the Fox, of course, with the 2 women running the farm, having sort of taken on that role in the war years. So overall, when we look at Lawrence's response to his own modern moment, it is one of almost a hatred, disgust with modernity. I was doing a little bit of research, sorry for this, Don't worry, I've just been recording a lot of lectures today. No viral stuff as far as I'm aware. Anyway, doing a little research for this lecture, reading an article about Lawrence's philosophy of history, and this critic, I think quite rightly, can't remember his name off the top of my head, I'm afraid, but quite rightly said that Lawrence really has this visceral hatred. It goes beyond even other, what we might call anti-modern modernists, people like Yeats, for example. Lawrence goes even beyond that with his contempt, his disgust for modernity, and his feeling that the present moment that he's living through is a degenerate one. But there is a flip side to that, because out of conflict, out of violence, and particularly out of patterns of conflict, Lawrence is a really dichotomous thinker. He thinks in these grand polarities, like many intellectuals of his own era, and indeed many artists, and he sees the clash of polarities of very grand oppositions leading to new forms of emergence and new forms of synthesis. And he does believe that modernity and conflict will generate new forms of life. And in thinking through that, there is a whole set of contexts which we might want to talk about, which is the ways that Darwinism and more broad evolutionary theories from the 19th century get taken up and quite often distorted. Whole patterns of degeneration, development, the emergence of species, the patterns of materialist, deterministic historical development. Artists have something of a field day with the new intellectual materials that people like Darwin and the popularizations of his theory permit them. You may have already met those in many other writers of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Those of you who did Jason Hall's Sex, Sensation, Scandal module, for example. When thinking about this cycle of violence, this cycle of opposition, which will kind of create these violent moments of regeneration, of new forms of existence, he overlays myth. And indeed, we can see Lawrence, again, like other modernists, Yeats here would be the most obvious example in his theories of cycles of history and certain metaphors he uses recurrently, like the tower, or the way he uses Byzantium as a mythic schema. Anyway, Lawrence shares with Yeats the sense that you can invent new myths, that you can use mythic schemas, update them to capture something of this historical volatility and this move towards violent historical renewal. We can see this in a lot of places, and we can see characters in Lawrence's novels, Aaron's Rod being a good example talking about that, but I've used an example from his poetry collection, Look, We Have Come Through, which is all about his travelling across Europe, across the Alps, down to Italy, with Frida, and a really kind of quasi-prophetic poem here, New Heaven and Earth. Yet rising from the tomb, from the black oblivion, stretching out my hand flung like a drowned man's hand on a rock. I touched her flank and knew I was carried by the current in death over to the new world, and was climbing out on the shore. Risen, not to the old world, the old changeless I, the old life, wakened not to the old knowledge, but to a new earth, a new I, a new knowledge, a new world of time. And no, I cannot tell you what it is, the new world. I cannot tell you the mad, astounded rapture of its discovery. I shall be mad with delight before I have done, and whosoever comes after me will find me in the new world, a madman in rapture. The very title, A New Heaven and Earth, is biblical, it's Christian, and you'll note that clear prophetic strain. But this is very much the case of Lawrence, like many modernists, taking up Christian apocalyptic or prophetic vocabularies, shaping them in his own fashion. These modernist mythologies, and certainly Laurentian mythologies, are not Christian, even though they have Christian echoes and often use Christian imagery. They're much more idiosyncratic, unique. As I've just said, you can see modernists like Lawrence inventing their own mythologies out of the fragments of the old. Indeed, insofar that we can discern a particular attitude, say Lawrence contra Christianity, Lawrence on Christianity, is that all conventional religion is essentially a series of masks, of transformations. He shares with someone like Sigmund Freud the idea that religious ritual, religious iconography, religious mythology and stories, what they are disguising, what they are seeking to express, are deeper primordial drives, predominantly sexual. Freud eventually, after World War One, suggests that the sex drive or libido is not the only way. There must be something else. He looks at the trenches, the destruction of World War One. He said there must be another drive. We can't just have libido. It wouldn't explain what we've seen in World War One. It won't. Why is civilization hurtled to the point of this violent collapse, this violent self-destruction? So he theorizes another drive, Thanatos, the death drive. So there's a polarity. Again, like I said, this is very early 20th century thinking between libido, the creative force, Thanatos, the self-destructive or destructive force. Anyway, Lawrence is not particularly on board with Freud. He thinks that Freud has some points, but he certainly doesn't believe in all of Freud's theories. But what he does share with psychoanalysis, what he does share with Freud, is this idea that a lot of the conventional surfaces of society and culture are encodings of a deeper, more primordial sense of human drives. Indeed, in a sense, they're pre-human, because everything that is conscious about the human being is structured and proper. And what Lawrence is interested in doing, like Freud and like many others, is penetrating beneath that civilized surface to something more primordial. At this moment, I don't know if you can see, my dog is here. We're going to be talking about animals in a little bit. We don't need the animalistic right now, so she can go down. Lawrence seeks the primordial self, and he wants to restore it in an extent. Part of why he's disgusted, or what he sees the problem with modernity as being, is that humans are alienated. Humans are unbalanced. They are disconnected from nature, and they are disconnected from the natural in themselves. They are disconnected from their deep selves. So again and again in Lawrence's thought, in his novels, in his poetry, we'll have vocabularies like the primordial self, the primal self, blood consciousness as opposed to higher consciousness. A lot of what Lawrence sees as avenues towards existential transformation are all about rebalancing those alienated relationships and restoring a connection to the primordial, to the primal, to the blood consciousness. We can see echoes of troubling fascist vocabularies in there, and those are not coincidental. Like I say, a lot of these kinds of thoughts and how they are influenced by, for example, scientific thinking, evolutionary thinking, thinking about degeneration or race consciousness. Lawrence is not unique here. This is very much a very common currency among European intellectuals, artists of the time period. One way of driving towards that restoration, and I think here is where we begin to see something about the symbolism of the fox in the fox, is what we might call the atavistic. Now, atavism is all about a reversion to ancestral forms, so it's very much in tune with certain early 20th century readings of evolutionary theories. As an anti-modern, or I'm posing D.H. Lawrence as an anti-modern here, we see again and again Lawrence turning to what I've called on the slide atavistic others, so kind of primitive, or we're uncomfortable of course now with that term primitive, but what Lawrence and his contemporaries would have seen of as primitive cultures. So curiously, he's really interested in the Etruscans, which is the Italian culture which come just before the Romans. When he goes to Mexico and New Mexico, he's really interested in the Mesoamerican cultures, those things like Aztecs or Incas, Toltecs, these cultures. He really loves ransacking their mythologies, and one of his novels, for example, is called Quetzalcoatl, or The Plumed Serpent, which is all about an Aztec god. And more generally, his work is fascinated by all forms of what we might call, quote unquote, what would have been understood as, at the time, the primitive. Things like rituals, things like myths, any cultural connections to the earth, to nature, to the animal, and more primal, or as Lawrence would see it, authentic forms of humanity, which have been overlain by the hypocrisies and the superficialities of modern civilization, of bourgeois culture. In that, it's worth saying he's not unusual. I've given you, I think this is Picasso on the left, Matisse on the right. Modernist art, modernist visual culture, modernist aesthetic culture more generally was fascinated by the kind of imagery of the Japanese, of the Chinese, of African, of the Mesoamerican, plundering non-European traditions and representing the non-European in a really problematic way, or we'd now see it as problematic. It's very much a movement of othering, but nevertheless they wanted to use these as a way of I guess getting in under the surfaces of European cultural traditions, which they saw as degenerate, and trying to revitalise European art through their vision of, their perspective on atavistic cultures, like the South American, like the African, like the Pacific Islanders. Gauguin and the Pacific Islands would be a great example there. I think I'm near the end. So I guess that whole play between D.H. Lawrence having an awareness of a degenerate modern moment, seeking to break through to some form of new heaven and earth, some new form of existence, but often going back into the past, indeed into the ancestral, to the primordial, to try and do that. That kind of going back to the past to go to the future, which is a really common modernist trope, raises the question of D.H. Lawrence as a modernist and what he was doing formally. Modernism, of course, often associated with artistic innovation, pushing art forward, the credo of modernism being make it new. Lawrence is usually classed, like I say, as an innovator, and just on that question, I'd sketch the way that critics have talked about his shorter fiction. The first phase, sort of before he writes those major novels, or certainly before the publication of, say, Woman in Love, early short stories. What critics have seen there is late 19th century and early 20th century European naturalism, writers like Maupassant or Chekhov. That's not an accidental lineage. Lawrence was very influenced by the editorship of Ford Madox Hueffer, who was the editor of a journal called the English Review, and they very much put that European naturalistic short story form as the model. So Lawrence's early short fiction would be in an East Midlands setting, it would be realistic, it would have a focus on dialogue, it would have a focus on what is known as significant action, and it would be in that lineage. In the middle phase, and I think something like The Fox can certainly be part of that phase, we find Lawrence becoming more psychological. The early short stories had often been interested in moments of self-realization, but that becomes more and more enigmatic, more and more psychologized in the middle short fiction. And here we might draw draw a parallel with something like Joyce's Dubliners or Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, where we have what Joyce would call epiphanies. These are enigmatic moments of self-realization, often partial. Elbow cough. Often partial self-realizations of character, and of course the end of The Fox could very much be put into that model. The later stories, the stories of the 1920s, they very much take on a more fantastic, fabular dimension. They move well beyond the naturalistic styles with which D.H. Lawrence had begun, and perhaps in The Fox, that kind of animal presence of The Fox, we can see some of that too. It's worth noting that many critics would say The Fox is not a short story per se. It is significantly longer than the normal modernist short story. Indeed, Lawrence realised that when he was looking at word counts that long, he described as if he was writing in quote unquote a new manner, and he called works like The Fox, there are several others, novelettes, or we might now say novellas, but interestingly he chose the word novelette. So he's connecting the ambitions of short fiction, perhaps, to some of the ambitions of his longer works there. Finally, studying Lawrence. Two kind of contexts here. One is that Lawrence is very unpopular now. Partly that's because, or mainly that's because, of feminist literary criticism of the 1970s and beyond, where Lawrence was really outed as a misogynist writer. Lady Chatterley's Lover was described by Kate Millett as the saving of a woman by Lawrence's kind of cult of the phallus. It's very, very problematic. And after that, Lawrence really did drop sharply off undergraduate syllabuses, and it's actually quite unusual to study him now. Arguably, to some extent, that's not just Millett, that's not just feminist revisionism, that's because certain critics, like F.R. Leavis would be the big one in the middle of the 20th century, had really overestimated Lawrence. I think Lawrence is a good novelist, but F.R. Leavis was saying that D.H. Lawrence was one of the 4 or 5 greatest novelists in the English tradition, and of course every action has a reaction, so there was always going to be a backlash against Lawrence. That backlash came at the same time as feminists began to get hold of his texts and really see problematic moments in them. So that's one context why I want to sort of say about why we might be studying Lawrence now. The second one is, I think, it's this uneasy relationship that Lawrence has with his own modern present moment. Because in his backlash against modernity, in his backlash against modern civilization, again, in his backlash against democracy and modern society and the bourgeois, he does it in a way that is, of course, intensively critical, which is very interesting. But as I've side noted at various points in this lecture, like many of his contemporaries, he takes on a kind of right-wing perspective or right-wing tropes, even proto-fascist or quasi-fascist tropes, and a lot of the things that we might see in Lawrence, things like the atavistic, things like blood consciousness, things like a hatred for bourgeois capitalism, we can see those same things in Nazism, in Italian fascism. It's no accident that Lawrence's favourite philosopher was Friedrich Nietzsche, who's probably the least well understood philosopher, precisely because of the way he was taken up in a very kind of twisted form by the Nazis. So Lawrence's reaction to his own time is very, very interesting, but it also has troubling elements. So here's 2 columns about Lawrence. It's not as simple as pro and con, but I think these are things to bear in mind about D.H. Lawrence per se, but also about his reaction to modernity. One is he does have that reactionary tendency. His philosophies tend to be very masculinist, very patriarchal. He generally writes as a man. He's fascinated with masculinity and saving masculinity. He has a very odd poem called The Virgin Youth, which is one of the very few poems I know in English about masturbation, about writing to your erect penis. Very, very odd for the contemporary reader, I think. There's that misogynist element to his fiction and his philosophy. In the way that he deals with other cultures, there is certainly the opening for a post-colonial reading, which would accuse him of racialized thinking. He can be really overbearingly prophetic. He can go on and on. His grand metaphysical and prophetic schemas can seem ridiculous. He often drops into what we would call bathos. I remember doing a tutorial about him in Oxford, so me and an Oxford tutor and one other student who read out a passage that she'd quoted from Woman in Love or The Rainbow in her essay, and we just burst into laughter because it was talking about this kind of dark sap rising from the man's loins, and it was just kind of ridiculous. Although obviously Lawrence takes himself very, very seriously. And the other thing is that Lawrence wrote an awful lot. That's one of the reasons why I've set a short story, because he's being forced to work in quite a disciplined form here. Lawrence wrote an awful lot. If you look at the complete poems, for example, it's hundreds and hundreds of pages. And, I like D.H. Lawrence's poems a lot, but most of those poems, or a lot of those poems, should have maybe never been written. So not looking great for Lawrence there, but on the plus side, on the pro column, on the defence of Lawrence column, first of all, he is the first genuinely working class writer in the English canon. Not just writing about the working class, not just writing sympathetically for the working class, but coming from a working class background, and we really shouldn't underestimate that. The first major working class writer to break through into the canon. That's big, and we shouldn't forget that. Secondly, he does foreground sex and sexuality. and to some extent a radical revision of how the relationships between the genders might work. He really takes the relationship between men and women, masculinity and femininity, very, very seriously. Like I say, that can become quite comic, but that's a hugely radical step when so much of the literature, even the relatively avant-garde literature around him, was quite prudish. He is unashamed. He wants to put sex very much central to the human experience, and guess what? It is central to the human experience. So again, what he's doing there I think is pretty important. Thirdly, there is a case for him as a modernist. He does interesting things. He does experimental things in poetry, in the novel, and he's a great short story writer. Is the other thing. So just merely on technical grounds, he deserves to be considered, because he's part of something. He certainly had relationships with other major modernists of both genders. It's worth pointing out. One of the curious things is, although in the 1970s and 1980s he gets slated as an unreconstructed misogynist, female writers of the time seem to really rate him and work with him. They saw something in Lawrence. And finally, the corollary of that disgust for modernity is an incredibly critical perspective. He does imagine radical transformations of modernity. He does take up those currents of industrialization, of social normativity, of the war, and he takes them and he wants to see something more. And that's fresh, that's exciting too. So I think that's me done. I'm not quite sure how long I took, but I'm sorry that the course had to obviously end on a virtual note. But I hope you enjoyed reading The Fox. I hope those of you who might be doing something with The Fox in the vivas or in the essays enjoy it. I'm more than happy, of course, to receive emails and so forth, to chat through your ideas. But for the time being, thank you and goodbye.